Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Valentine's Day special on sustainable infrastructure. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Anders Nordheim. I'm with the Sustainable Finance team at WWF-Singapore, and we are delighted to have you here to talk about a report that we have launched on mapping ESG integration in public infrastructure in the Asia Pacific, as well as a panel discussion around the topic with many esteemed experts in this field. We will start the webinar with opening remarks from Enrique Florencio, Secretary General of ADFIAP, which will then be followed with remarks from Kate Newman, who is Vice President, Sustainable Finance Infrastructure at WWF US via video. And for the panel discussion, we are delighted to have Lavant Thiru, Executive Director of Infrastructure Asia, Tufika Hock of the Global Infrastructure Facility, Darwin Tajavanata of the PT Sarana Multi-Infrastructure, Catherine Thode of the Asian Development Bank, Anuj Mehta, also the Asian Development Bank. And for the presentation of the results and some reflections from our study, we have our very own Sergio Giduk from the WWF Singapore team. First of all, some housekeeping notes. This is a listen-only webinar, and it is being recorded. And we will be putting a recording of it onto our YouTube channel once it is done. Please do come forward with questions for the panelists during the session, either via the chat function or via the Q&A function. If you have any technical difficulties, just please reach out to us and let us know, and we will try to support you as best as possible. So before we, and then we have the agenda for today. We will start with the opening remarks, and then we will have a presentation from Sergio, which covers a lot of the information from the report that I talked about. There'll be a short panel discussion, and then a little bit of time to address some of your questions before we have the closing of the sessions. Now, before we get into the content, we'd like to, first of all, get to know you a little better. So what I'd like you to do, first of all, is put into the chat function, put into the chat box, the city in which you're currently located. So if everybody can go into the chat box and just put in the city you're located, we'll have a little bit of a better view of who's here and where you're coming from. Now we seem to have a wonderful range of countries and territories represented. A few in the ASEAN region, some from Australia, a few Europeans, Russia also quite well represented. So that's fantastic to see. Oh, and also Africa. So welcome to everybody. We are also going to have a short poll to see what type of institutions you are representing. Sergio, if you want to launch that. So please just select the institution, the type of organization that you represent. It's just a very quick poll for you so that we have a little bit of a feel for the type of audience that we have in the room today. So we're slowly getting in the responses. We're at yeah, pretty much over 70% now. So Sergio, if you want to show the results. Able to show the results, Sergio?
Yes, I'm showing them now.
Ah, okay. Apologies, I'm not seeing them on my screen. I guess they just go to participants, so then at least you can see who your fellow attendees are on the panel today. So with that, I think we're going to head straight into the opening remarks, and I'm delighted to welcome Enrique Florencio, Secretary General of ADFIAP. Please go ahead, Enrique.
Thank you so much, Anders. Distinguished attendees, speakers, colleagues in the development community, ladies and gentlemen, a warm greetings to everyone. On behalf of the Association of Development Financing Institutions in Asia and the Pacific, or ADFIAP, I wish to thank WWF-Singapore and the Asia Sustainable Finance Initiative for making this event possible. The same goes for our members who helped us in the completion of this study by sending their survey responses. ADFIAP has partnered with WWF Singapore under the Asia Sustainable Finance Initiative to promote progress on sustainable finance in the region. The first knowledge product to emerge from this collaboration is a report which documents how DFIs in the Asia Pacific, predominantly involved in infrastructure investment, has integrated climate and biodiversity-related ESG factors into their operations and decision-making systems. ADFIAP, in its 45 years of existence, being the focal point of 90 DFIs in 38 countries, has been at the forefront of embracing and embedding the principles of economic, environmental, social, and governance aspects, together with our member DFIs, that led to the institutionalization of green finance in their loan portfolios. ESG issues are of increasing concern to the investor community nowadays. Companies, including DFIs, are also facing rising expectations from different stakeholders to take a proactive approach to manage ESG risk and opportunities as part of their business strategies. The global investment community's interest in ESG issues has reached its tipping point. Investors are now demanding corporate leaders improve sustainability practices that both benefit their firm's bottom line and create a greater impact on the wider community. As investments dedicated to ESG and sustainability are now escalating, companies need to hasten their response to institutional investors' demands for transparent and detailed ESG disclosures. Further, the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals has caused a shift in the role of DFIs, seeking to encourage all key players to integrate their economic approach with ESG embedded on a model in which the private and public sectors play complementary roles in promoting inclusive and sustainable progress. This is why our discussion today is very timely. We will cover the current state of play, problems, opportunities, and influencing levers in public infrastructure funding. We will also go over what ESG integration means for a DFI and what conditions should be considered for DFIs to include ESG elements into their funding decisions, and look into how ESG integration in public finance will evolve in the Asia-Pacific region over the next 5 years. I hope you will find these topics stimulating and inspiring. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for those remarks. And I think we'll move on to the opening remarks from Kate via video.
Dear esteemed panelists and members of the public, the world is changing and it's changing fast. Recent years have seen a steady increase in urbanization, and plans to scale up new infrastructure investment are estimated to reach around $100 trillion by 2050. That's double what we've been spending to date at least. All of this is happening in a context of sudden shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and the increasingly severe disruptions caused by our intertwined environmental crises that include climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and waste. But it's clear that infrastructure is crucial for development, and it's at the very heart of our efforts to meet the SDGs, our Sustainable Development Goals. For infrastructure to serve a positive purpose, risks to people and the planet must be managed while we strive to enhance our societal, environmental, and economic well-being. With all the change we're experiencing, infrastructure must also be resilient and flexible to allow both ecosystems and society to adapt and continue to thrive. This means that when we build, we need to build for the future, and we need to do it quickly and efficiently and sustainably. We can no longer use the business as usual approach to infrastructure, which is leading to ecological destruction and massive carbon dioxide emissions. Development finance institutions, or DFIs, play a critical role in financing the investments and leveraging the resources from the private sector needed to deliver the infrastructure that we require for achieving the SDGs. They also play a strong supportive role in the development of national policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks. This, combined with their significant assets and financing capacity, makes them perfectly placed to actively contribute to the Paris Agreement and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The report we're exploring today is an effort to help DFIs integrate ESG, or environment, social, and governance factors into infrastructure investments and lending, and to assist the infrastructure community and DFIs in developing a more consistent approach to analyzing the sustainability of infrastructure projects. It's the latest in a series of initiatives that WWF has engaged in with partners to examine sustainable infrastructure finance and ESG integration. While the previous work focused on private investors, this report focuses on the development and public sector finance actors. It aims to help DFIs in East and Southeast Asia support and encourage sustainable infrastructure investments and ESG integration in the years to come. So we thank you very much for joining today. I hope you enjoy this fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much to Kate, who joined us from the US via recording. So with those opening remarks, it's now my pleasure to introduce Sergio Giduk, our research lead for sustainable infrastructure finance at WWF-Singapore, who will go through the results of the report.
Thank you, Anders, and thank you, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Today, it's a pleasure to present some of the key results and activities from this workstream. So as you've heard before, the study set out to explore how a selection of DFIs in Southeast and East Asia, which are predominantly involved in infrastructure investment and lending, have been integrating climate and biodiversity-related factors into their decision-making systems. Thus, the focus is on the E from the ESG and to a little extent to S as it relates to infrastructure. It highlights some of the efforts that DFIs have made to date, identifies constraints and challenges, and provides constructive recommendations to help overcome these. We selected 10 DFIs using 5 criteria: a minimum total asset value of $200 million US. DFIs must engage in the financing and lending to infrastructure projects in Asia. Each country in which the government is the main shareholder of a particular DFI should be represented by a maximum of 3 and a minimum of 1 institutions. DFIs must be members of ADFIAP and have expressed their consent to participate in the study. We employed mixed methods for data collection, including a literature review to assess publicly available sustainability strategies, mandates, and impact reporting, an online survey to provide specific information on key issues in the assessment framework, and a semi-structured interview to provide a deep dive into the subject matters and identify potential case studies. The areas of inquiry were based on our sustainable banking assessment framework, which initially was designed for private banks, but we've simplified and adapted it to DFIs. But the pillars and criteria that you see in the diagram signify what we think is a robust ESG integration of some of the components of this. The indicators were assessed and further validated according to their relevance to the architecture of the Financing Common Joint Declaration, as well as the International Development Finance Club Green Finance Building Blocks, the SDG Target 15A and the OECD Rio markers as they concern biodiversity finance. We applied a score of 1, 0.5, and 0 to explicit, implicit, or no evidence. And generally, the data collection involved looking at evidence of broad sustainability mandates or commitments. We've looked at whether there are climate change or biodiversity strategies, what their safeguard systems imply, whether there's a strong emphasis on the mitigation hierarchy, or whether there are any innovative financial instruments. So we've done also a quick heat map, and we've identified that the physical effects of climate change, followed by carbon emissions, are the most important factors influencing investment lending. And this is in line with the fact that many DFIs have started to develop explicit targets and strategies that relate to climate change. On the other hand, biodiversity and habitat loss, they seem to be the least important environmental factors to DFI's infrastructure investments, and you will hear some of the reasons for that. Interestingly, water and waste are also very important factors, and that's probably because these sectors are highly regulated, and some jurisdictions require project developers to offset the impact of these projects. So purpose is an important pillar because sustainability is a necessary condition for long-term national growth and a dynamic topic with constant developments which need to be followed. Most DFIs acknowledge the economic and social risks associated with climate change in their corporate strategy, vision, and mission. However, their acknowledgement of biodiversity-related risks remain limited. Most mandates are linked to the SDGs. However, social and economic considerations tend to be prioritized over environmental ones. And that's despite the linkages between climate, social, and economic considerations. Most DFIs participate in sustainable finance initiatives, such as UNEP-5 Principles for Responsible Banking or the Blue Economy Finance Principles. And half of DFIs have received accreditation from the Green Climate Fund, meaning that they have been seen to have specialized capacities in driving climate action and are major conduits of related international funds. This in turn indicates that there is willingness across DFIs to make a commitment to align all financial flows with the Paris Agreement and thus mitigate climate change. But this is proving a significant organizational challenge. Policies. Good performance is important as transparent policies ensure intentions are embedded into daily business operations. Specific policies are required for industries with high environmental and social risks and otherwise prominent cross-cutting topics such as climate change and biodiversity loss. Safeguard policies, which inform what DFIs will or won't finance, are the main mechanism used for managing ENS risks. Generally, larger DFIs have their own safeguard framework, while less resourced DFIs have adopted the IFC performance standards or relied on the environmental assessment process. But this is usually aligned with government regulation, which is more about ensuring that project impacts are within acceptable limits of harm, rather than demonstrating positive contribution. Some DFIs follow internationally recognized principles and standards, such as the Equator Principles, although often DFIs are not official signatories of these schemes due to associated actual or perceived costs to do with the application process, third-party reviews, and so on. Many DFIs lack ambitious outcome-based policy requirements, such as net zero or biodiversity gains, as well as a dedicated strategy for tackling climate change, and even more so for tackling biodiversity loss. Some also lack ambitious sector-specific requirements or up-to-date exclusionary criteria for sensitive issues such as financing coal projects, deforestation, and the protection of marine biodiversity. However, some DFIs have released public statements indicated a halt to financing coal, but in some cases, this has yet to be officially translated into policy. Regarding COVID-19 response, we've seen somewhat a risk aversion among DFIs. They have shown relatively weak financial commitment to green recovery and indicated that challenges remain. Health spending and mitigating the economic impact associated with the pandemic became a top objective. DFIs have focused on protecting existing investments and portfolios and preserving jobs rather than launching, for example, COVID-19 blended finance vehicles. This risk aversion makes it particularly challenging for DFIs to attract even more risk-averse commercial investors and find new investable opportunities in the near term. However, COVID-19 has catalyzed conversations on green recovery and has put a focus on nature. Half of DFIs made a public statement on green recovery and realized the opportunities and urgency associated with it. The ambition is to continue on the momentum of the green assistance once we are past that. But we think that choosing between mitigating the economic impact of COVID-19 and tackling zoonotic disease is a false dichotomy. Both need to be tackled at the same time, and stewardship for current and future generations, not assets, should be liquidized and used as leverage. The trend of growing debt could present opportunities for promoting innovative financial instruments such as debt for nature swaps, but these should be used as last resort. A good performance regarding processes is important because effective implementation of ENS policies requires transparent integration of relevant criteria into client and transaction approval processes so that policy enforcement is meaningful with consequences for non-compliance. Many DFIs lack adequate use of infrastructure-related ESG evaluation, valuation, and reporting tools like Envision, Shore, Savvy, Treadis. And the reasons include the fact that these schemes are not mandated or applicable, and some DFIs may lack internal expertise or awareness of them. ESG factors are mostly applied in the context of a qualitative negative early screening rather than integrating them into financial models. DFIs don't tend to use commercially available tools, analytics, geospatial data sets for ENS risk assessment, but rather data that comes from governments, NGOs, universities, or other locally available resources. Since data is not always collected by DFIs themselves, but based on government reporting from project developers, sometimes there are data quality, suitability, and access issues. And we've seen some anecdotes regarding, for example, the use of IBAT tool for biodiversity. Also, less than half of DFIs screen projects for physical climate risk, and only about a third tend to do so for climate transition risk. Impact measurement tends to focus more on climate change, and that's probably due to clear assessment templates and international consensus compared to biodiversity loss. The truth is that biodiversity is viewed as complicated with no straightforward metric, no clear national corporate targets, and the systemic risk posed by biodiversity loss are insufficiently understood. Most DFIs do not yet have the capacity to adequately address biodiversity risks. Regarding people, good performance is also important because effectively implementing policies and processes requires sufficient staff capacity and clear allocation of responsibilities to different departments in senior management. Most DFIs have senior management and board oversight of ENS issues. However, the integration of sustainability into staff appraisal is lacking, and capacity is a key concern. Half of the DFIs have a dedicated ESG or sustainability team and provide general training to staff on ESG-related issues, but there's a scarcity of specialized technical knowledge, particularly regarding nature-related topics. Staff training tends to be in its infancy, focusing mostly on those associated with sustainability issues, and is frequently voluntarily failing to fully prepare employees to appraise risk and opportunities. And this is particularly true for biodiversity-related issues, nature-based solutions. However, there's a very strong appetite for training, particularly on nature-related risk and opportunities, and this is an opportunity for NGOs, CSOs, and for those most advanced on this topic. Products is also important because integrating ESG issues into business operations tends to not only entail adequate risk assessment, but also tapping into business opportunities. Most DFIs have issued a green financial and non-financial products and technical assistance, and or have set up specialized funds to address the SDGs and fund sustainable infrastructure. There is a wider range of instruments used in financing climate mitigation and adaptation than compared to biodiversity, and debt finance is the most predominant instrument used for financing climate change opportunities, which is followed then by grants and technical assistance. Renewable energy is often a target, but few, if any, targets or products are dedicated to addressing biodiversity loss. In the absence of a widely agreed international template, most DFIs struggle to define nature-based solutions or to identify and integrate related performance indicators. And this prevents them from making a clear business case for biodiversity positive infrastructure financing opportunities. Portfolio. Good performance is important as the assessment of ENS risks at client and transaction level only provides a micro level snapshot of issues which ultimately accumulate at the portfolio level. The disclosure of risk exposure indicators and setting targets helps in dealing with material ESG risks and business model transitioning. Less than half of DFIs review their portfolio exposure in a frequent manner to climate and biodiversity risks and will fully disclose the results and methodology used. Few tend to use the joint MDB methodology for tracking climate finance. Most follow the GRI sustainability reporting guidelines, but this tends to pick up mainly on operational issues. Reporting seems to be more advanced for climate impacts, but only one DFI in our selection follows TCFD recommendations. A lack of knowledge of biodiversity risks is echoed by a lack of relevant commitments and adoption of reporting tools. Many DFIs have not set up adequate green finance targets that are supported by a robust performance indicators that would track all biodiversity and climate finance flows. Currently, DFIs find it easier to measure the positive contributions of their climate-related investments compared to biodiversity investments. And finally, no DFI promotes an integrated biodiversity and climate change investment strategy or reporting framework yet. There are more enablers for assessing and managing climate change risk as opposed to biodiversity risks. For example, the availability of technical expertise among staff, efficient and effective incentives and regulations, and pressure from stakeholders all seem to favor addressing climate change. And conversely, there are more barriers for assessing and managing biodiversity risks. For both, the availability of data, technical expertise, and capacity among staff still are key barriers, but these are more pronounced for biodiversity. There remains a sense in the finance world that biodiversity is dealt with in nature-specific projects only. Although this is changing, there is a need for better understanding that all projects affect biodiversity. And this comes down to defining it, and some DFIs are working together to develop a common approach to identifying and reporting of biodiversity-related financial risks. Final slides. The area which most DFIs are planning to develop comprise updating sector policies and strategies and supporting governments in developing enabling environments. DFIs are also planning to do more to help the private sector overcome certain challenges, such as the low bankability of sustainable infrastructure projects, as well as high risk via technical assistance and de-risking mechanisms. So if there's one slide that you remember from this presentation, is this one. And the results indicate that there is room for improvement across all areas. It may be needed more in some than in others. DFI showed the most progress with the products pillar of the assessment framework, followed by relatively good compliance with the purpose and people pillar. There is room for improvement regarding the policies and processes pillars, and the least progress was identified with the portfolio pillar. Now, while the first step for DFIs is to do no harm with their investments, the ultimate aim must be to move beyond negative ESG screening and progress towards sustainability-themed business lines, which facilitate the achievement of the SDGs and other national commitments that relate to climate change and biodiversity loss. DFIs should aim to redirect finance to investments that benefit biodiversity and the climate through respective mandates. They must develop and implement time-bound and target-led biodiversity positive institutional commitments in line with those made by peers and their national governments. And they could use processes such as NDCs and NAPs. And also DFIs could start by incorporating explicit climate and biodiversity positive goals into COVID recovery finance. They should also try to reorient to support a different private sector. And by this, I mean to focus more on development returns instead of financial returns and adapt business models, for example, to integrate natural capital concept to allow for more risk taking. At a minimum, DFI should fully integrate ESG factors into risk management frameworks, and they can adopt frameworks such as the one you see in the slide. But the bottom line is that limiting investment activities that are harmful to biodiversity or the climate will be insufficient to reverse the erosion of planetary boundaries, which provide a safe operating space for economic prosperity. DFIs must strive to become more transformational. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and now I pass the floor to Anders to moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for that presentation. We appreciate that some of the fonts there were a little bit small to read, so thank you for that comment. The presentation will be made available to all attendees, as well as the recording of this webinar. And of course, there's also the full paper, which we can refer to. and a link to that is provided towards the end of the slide deck. So you'll have availability of all of these resources to go over it in detail. We'll now move on to the panel discussion, and if during the panel discussion you have specific questions, either for the full panel or specific participants, please do continue to add those to the chat, and we'll try to address them at the Q&A towards the end. So moving into the panel discussion side of this webinar, recent years have seen an ongoing buildup of urbanization, sudden sharp shocks like COVID-19 pandemic, and increasingly severe disruptions caused by the intertwined climate and biodiversity crises. So all this means that when we build infrastructure, we need to really build it quickly, efficiently, and sustainably. Now, Lavan, you've been involved in a lot of infrastructure projects around the region here. What, in your view, are some of the barriers and enablers to financing sustainable infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific region?
Thanks very much, Anders. And before I start, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Financing sustainable infrastructure actually requires a multi-dimensional approach. A strong public-private partnership between governments and the private sector is actually a cornerstone for this. Private capital is key. That many governments' pandemic strain further highlights the important role of the private sector in terms of financing infrastructure projects. In fact, the ADB has estimated that about 40% of infrastructure investments in Asia will need to come from the private sector. Going forward, this could actually be larger. I'd like to focus on two barriers, and thinking about enablers, I'll also talk about two of them. First up on barriers, actually the region has, in a sense, struggled to furnish a sufficient supply in the form of bankable project pipelines to match the long-term capital requirements. This can be attributed to in some instances, a lack of capacity and resources to prepare, plan, and prioritize infrastructure projects that are attractive to private capital. Upstream project preparation is actually a critical first step in making infrastructure assets or infrastructure projects bankable. That is, having infrastructure projects prepared to a stage where the risk is appropriately allocated between the public and the private sector, such that institutional investors are willing to engage. The good news is that there are many such project preparation funds available. In fact, Infrastructure Asia's own count puts it at least 30 of such funds, and they are spread across the world. Second, a lack of specialized training and reward system for sustainable performance, which was highlighted in the report. That's another factor. There's a lack of capability and capacity among the various folks involved in project preparation in terms of sustainability. Infrastructure Asia, we have developed several capacity building programs, such as a growing infrastructure course, where regional government officials are invited to thematic courses to learn more about how to enable sustainable and resilient infrastructure development for the region's long-term economic goals. We have developed this course together with the World Bank Group and the Singapore Management University. On enablers, I'd like to talk about two of them. The first one, governments. Governments play a crucial role in attracting private capital into the market. The quality of a country's investment enabling environment is important for unlocking greater private investment in infrastructure. This is true regardless of the income levels, although it is even more pertinent for lower income countries. Analysis has shown that countries with stronger enabling environment are associated with higher levels of private infrastructure investment as a share of GDP on average. An enabling environment includes strong governance and institutions, effective regulatory frameworks that promote investment and competition, transparent public planning and procurement process, and the capacity of governments to fund infrastructure. But this is changing, we feel, as nations are adjusting policies to address climate risks, leading to a concerted effort. Increasingly, banks and financial institutions will include sustainability as a requirement for providing loans. However, we do see that at certain levels, some of these commitments can be strengthened. My final point is on risk allocation. And this is due to the longer term horizon of infrastructure projects, which necessitates that such assets are well managed over their life in the long term. It's critical for institutional investors to mobilize greater capital. The use of credit enhancement products can help mobilize private capital. Taken together with the strategic use of blended finance, it can help optimize the risk-return profile for institutional investors and enhance the overall bankability of projects. The strategic role that multilateral development banks and development financial institutions in the provision of such credit enhancements has also been reinforced by the G20 Eminent Persons Group, which identified MDB credit enhancements as a more efficient use of capital. So MDBs and DFIs play a key role in this regard by serving as intermediaries between emerging market governments and private sectors, equipped with the tools to support policy setting and institutional reform efforts with governments to reduce market risk, build bankable infrastructure projects, and develop and execute risk mitigation instruments. Thanks, Anders.
Thanks very much, Lavan, for that information. Tawfiq, we know that public budgets alone remain inefficient to close the sustainable infrastructure investment gap, but Lavan also mentioned the really importance of public and private collaboration in this space, but we also know that pipeline is potentially an issue here. So how do you think that, from your experience, can DFIs and the private sector help to address the limited supply of bankable sustainable infrastructure projects and thus work together to close the investment gap in Asia Pacific within the context of increasingly constrained public budgets?
Thanks, Anders. Actually, Lavan is making my answer very simple because he has already addressed this. It's and I think all of our panelists, all of my co-panelists, we're in the same space of trying to create bankable projects. So I'm with the Global Infrastructure Facility. We were created as a G20 initiative. We sit in the World Bank group, and that's what we do day in, day out. I think we have to go back maybe to why there are such few bankable projects. And I am picking up on something Sergio mentioned on the report. I felt that it was a bit of a harsh report on DFIs. I think some highlights of why DFIs are not doing such as some of these things is important. I mean, if you look at, there are lots of numbers, ADB's number of lack of infrastructure in Asia, the World Bank numbers, the GIH, lots of figures out there. Main story is there is a deep demand for infrastructure for growing Asia, be it in more middle income countries such as Indonesia and Vietnam, or more developing countries such as Bangladesh and Laos. But going back to where the struggles are, it's the affordability of investments. And I think Sergio or the report made a comment saying that we need to do more projects that are economically have economic returns rather than commercial returns. Well, that is quite a challenge, right? Because we know that public funds are limited. Even MDB's funds are limited. If we were to put all of the World Bank's, ADB's, AIIB's balance sheet together, we still couldn't meet all of Asia's infrastructure needs. So hence the working together with the private sector, and we know, infrastructure institutional investors, it should be a marriage made in heaven between long-term assets, long-term liabilities. Well, there is a mismatch. Investors are putting in your pension money, my pension money, with expectations of returns that will be not only reasonable, but match the risks of the project. So there goes the risk element. So Lavan mentioned risk matrices and risk mitigation. I think one of the key, for me, some of the key problems are political planning. I happen to sit in Singapore, and this country is fantastic at planning, but the size of the country is, of course, different than an Indonesia or a Bangladesh or an India. How do you do planning in complex and challenging markets? And then making policy decisions on, we all work a lot in the energy sector, tariff regimes I believe only Korea and Singapore actually have electricity tariffs that reflect cost structures, not even Japan. So I'm not even talking about emerging Asia, I'm talking about very well-developed Asia. Why is that? Because of budget constraints. So how do we work on those risks? So I'm not saying anything new, but blended finance, the use of blending in concessional funds to address layers of risk that the private sector are not going to be able to take on is really critical. And if you see at COP26, as well as Paris, I think blended finance really has come up as an area that we need to be able to use in a more efficient way, because for projects to take 5 years, 10 years to prepare and be delivered, the demand has completely changed again. So coming back to the original question, other than project preparation, I think that's been answered already, but something that we are doing at the GIF, which is slightly different. So, traditionally MDBs and DFIs have prepared projects, brought them to the market for investors. We're changing the equation. We're actually working together with the private sector to large investors, large institutional investors, to see how we can scale up climate finance, sustainable finance. And it doesn't go alone. So it's really bringing in investors who know the markets and have appetite for some of the risks in the market, and together with the private sector, with the public sector and MDBs, DFIs to look at how we can address these things. So this is under this initiative that we have launched called the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, where we're working at the moment in India, together with the likes of Macquarie, SBI, HSBC, Tata. So really looking at what's the next thing to look at, and hopefully we'll be doing the same with PTSMI in Indonesia shortly. I was conscious on my 3 minutes, which I have gone over, so I could say many other things, but I think my co-panelists have many things to say too.
Thank you very much, Tafika. I appreciate that. And yeah, speaking of complex markets, and also turning perhaps to from complex financing structures to complex sustainability issues. Darwin, PTSMI has been taking concrete steps to support climate finance projects in Indonesia. For example, your SDG Indonesia One blended finance platform. But with regard to financing commitments, what sort of challenges does your DFI face in setting similar commitments for complex issues like biodiversity, as you did for climate, or indeed in expanding biodiversity positive investments? What are some of the challenges here?
Well, thank you, Anders, for the question. A very good afternoon for everyone. For PT Sarana Multi Infrastructure, or we call PTSMI, I think we still have certain limitation in terms for our operation in supporting the very complex, diverse biodiversity projects. So I think we have a limitation in terms of the sectors that we could finance, because we are focusing more on the infrastructure. And the current mandates, it's not really easy for PTSMI to finance projects which are primarily aimed at biodiversity improvement. But within the sectors that PTSMI can finance, most projects do not have specific targets on biodiversity performance. That's one thing that we are facing. And most of the project approach issues concerning biodiversity in mitigative manners as to minimize their impact. That's what we are doing. This is in line with PTSMI's approach, in which biodiversity issues has been included as part of the assessment during the financing evaluation process, and has been an important consideration for the committee's approval. One examples that I can share with you is that in supporting one of the biggest toll road project in Indonesia, in the Trans Sumatra, what we do is actually we supporting the project developer to start considering for the construction for the 11th bridge at the beginning of the construction of this toll road to avoid the operational risk. The Pekanbaru-Dumai toll road has cut the elephant migration route and has the potential to cause accident to motorists, endanger protected animals, and increase the number of conflict between humans and elephants. Ministry of Environment and Forestry informations it's more about 100 elephants cross this trail every year. So with that, we have a recommendation for the project developer to start construct this elephant tunnel, and it's being implemented by the developers. That's just an example that what we are doing at the moment, but we see that we will be more active in promoting for this biodiversity, for sure. But again, the issue is more on the how we can expand the mandate. That's one thing, and how to set what is actual the biodiversity target for each of the project that we finance. That's also the second thing. And overall, I think for PTSMI as the new institution recently established, so I think what we need is also kind of support on how we can measure what is the biodiversity mean for the financing activities that we need to make. That's probably my share, Anders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darwin. I appreciate those reflections and appreciate some of the complexity in these projects. It's a lot of issues to tackle around biodiversity. Maybe providing some answers to these challenges from the ADB side, Catherine. What are some of the most important steps that DFIs can take to improve the mainstreaming of climate and biodiversity into their portfolios?
So good afternoon, everyone. And just to say thank you for this report, which I think is very timely, and particularly with Indonesia's chairing of the G20. And it was in 2019, the agreement of the quality infrastructure principles, which I think provide a framework for lots of DFIs to begin to look at some of these complex issues. So I just want to touch on three things that are kind of highlighted in the report. And I think the first, which has come up, is several times, is the reporting and tracking. And MDBs have agreed tracking of climate finance, and last year we agreed to begin to look and say what do nature positive investments look like across our portfolio. And this is kind of a stepwise approach. ADB's begun to look at this in terms of how it invests in ocean investments, and categorizing what investment would be addressing or what infrastructure investments with the framework that aligns with the sustainable blue economy principles. But I think the challenge is that we also need to get better at explaining the costs of poor infrastructure development. So when we're talking about building a road and then there's a landslide and the road is affected, so what can we do to better build in resiliency and explain those costs more clearly up front, and on again, we can perhaps learn or follow a bit more from the climate side, but we're working on natural capital accounting and developing within ADB a natural capital lab, which will help to better mainstream valuation of those kind of project benefits. But I think one of the challenges of that, and that's come up today, is the need for cross-cutting governance arrangements. It's all very well if you've got specialist units who know about the climate or the environment impacts, but how are we working together to capture the multiple benefits in multi-sector projects? And at a government level, I'd just like to mention that the Indonesian Coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs is perhaps a good example of a government approach to looking at how can we bring in these different sectors. While internally within ADB, we've established a nature-based solutions working group to share experiences from different sector examples and projects and identify ways to be able to take a more upstream approach. And one of the things that DFIs can do, and ADB is trying to do, is increase requirements for strategic environment assessments at the start of projects. And also we're looking to work with FIDIC, the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, to see where there are ways for mainstreaming some of this within the contracts that we set up. And then the third thing that I'd just like to mention is moving up to this much more risk-based approach and incorporating this in our credit assessment, which will then change that. And so ADB is pleased to have signed up to the task force on climate-related risk, and we're just beginning to implement that now. And we're also watching and observing the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And so I think it's important that all DFIs begin to look at this from a credit risk perspective. And then that links into, and I know my colleague Anuj is going to speak a little bit more about some of the different products and innovative financing products we have, but also developing risk transfer products and risk, particularly risk financing solutions. And so we've been working, particularly highlighting in coral reef insurance, but looking at ways that we can begin to change the risk profiles of some of the infrastructure investments that we might be making in coastal resilience. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So a multitude of opportunities for DFIs, different actions that they can take in order to start at least addressing some of the climate and biodiversity issues that exist, both from a risk perspective and others. I'm pleased that you touched upon nature-based solutions. It's something that we at WWF have a particular fondness of. So, but they're also quite challenging projects to work on. They are talked about as a way to integrate biodiversity and climate actions into infrastructure projects for tackling environmental degradation, but we often struggle to define nature-based solutions or identify and integrate related performance indicators. So I'm delighted to have Anuj here from the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility to explain to us what innovative finance mechanisms could act as a positive solution for integrating climate change and natural capital into development finance. Anuj, please go ahead.
Thanks, Anders. Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me clear. So at the outset, let me say that as a banker, former banker who's now in development, there is nothing which is that new in finance. There's always something which has been tried somewhere. The question is of how do you put forward something which is appropriate for a sector, a theme, or a subsector. And there are plenty of examples of what's been done on climate, green. I speak for ACGF, on the green side. Done by the multilaterals, as Tawfiqa said, there's a lot of examples there. I try to classify innovative mechanisms, innovative in terms of the first time use, in two buckets. So there are lots of individual things you can talk about, but let's look at it in two buckets. There are finance mechanisms which are de-risking mechanisms, and these are de-risking mechanisms where you've got a new technology being tried for whatever impact you're trying to get, or a new geography where they're trying it for the first time, or for example, an untested revenue model. Those areas need a de-risking mechanism, and there are plenty of them. Whether you take the viability gap fund mechanism, which was tried in India for PPPs, but you can apply the same, whether you take a guarantee fund, which is basically to try and guarantee exits for green capital coming into projects. So I put that into de-risking. And when we talk about things like coastal protection, when we're talking about oceans health, those areas, they basically have untested revenue models. The second type of mechanism is the accelerate mechanisms, where the basic project is bankable, it is sustainable, but you're trying to accelerate the impact of that in terms of the indicators you spoke about. So now those are basically where you create an incentive mechanism where you basically say a certain concessionality in a fund or a certain improved return in a fund if you beat a certain indicator by 10%, to put it very simplistically. Both these mechanisms need to be linked to two things: global standards, what you were referring to as standards, but basically frameworks. And number two, to basically very well developed bankable projects, which are, and sorry, the second one is actually visibility. So for example, when green transport was a big thing for PPPs, the announcement was of a viability gap fund to do this. It became a very, very important thing. It created a lot of buzz in terms of projects. So I would say a visible national mechanism which does one of these two things. The underlying structure of the mechanism we can talk about. There are lots of examples. And from our side, I'd like to sort of probably mention three things. The ACGF itself is a de-risking mechanism. It's ASEAN owned, managed by ADB. It's already raised 2 billion in the last 3 years since it was launched. It's already got a pipeline of 29 projects. 6 have already been approved. So a lot has already happened. Now, of course, the mechanism is tapering or is changing from country to country, and that has to be done. So you cannot have one size fits all. I cannot say, let's just create a VGF or a guarantee mechanism. Has to be structured. So the ACGF not only has a mechanism, it has a project structuring team, rolls up its sleeves and actually structures projects. And that's the role of the DFIs. We create those model projects, which are then hopefully replicated again and again. Second one, on the Blue Hub, we've launched a Blue Hub in Indonesia last year. That's trying to create and structure projects like marine finance facilities using things like credits. You'll never get a revenue model in some part of coastal projects. So create what you call an annuity or a shadow revenue mechanism based on somewhere where you can raise revenues, whether it's from taxes or whether it's from some other source. And the third, to sort of also complement Tawfika, the World Bank Seychelles, the work that they did on the blue bonds initially, those were good examples, which of course need to be mainstreamed, adapted, replicated. So, I look at these things in these two buckets, again, just to close with de-risking and accelerate, the two mechanisms, right, in which you can put in different structures, but they need to be led by governments, national governments with support from DFIs to actually make this happen, mainstream it, and then create projects. I'll stop there. Hopefully that was not too long. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anuj. There was great information on the different types of innovative mechanisms, or perhaps not so innovative mechanisms if they've mostly been done before. But it was a nice way of structuring it into de-risking and acceleration. Just looking at the time, we have 2 minutes left here, and if I'm not mistaken, I think most of the questions in the Q&A have already been addressed in writing. So maybe I can just, as a closing remark from each of you, COVID-19 recovery, building back better, all of this has been discussed in various elements. It almost runs like a theme through most discussions these days. But the panel here has a particular expertise within DFIs and public finance, which I think is particularly interesting for this issue or this question. So, I mean, I'd like to ask all of you, what do you think the DFIs can do or should do to ensure that COVID-19 recovery financing really actually builds back better, and does it also for climate and biodiversity especially? And I'm going to run through you the same way that we started. So, Lavan, you're first up.
Thanks, Anders. Actually, I think Anuj covered it very well when he talked about de-risking and accelerating the impact. Actually, the point I wanted to make was related to de-risking and how we might think about doing things a little bit differently. And we've seen some early signs of it, right, where rather than be involved totally in a project, MDBs and DFIs have been able to do catalytic finance, for example, in anchoring certain transactions. And by anchoring the transactions, they've actually given comfort to the institutional investors and crowded them in. And this has a really positive impact because thereon, the next level of fundraising, actually the DFIs and the MDBs can step back and the private sector can do some of these transactions. The important thing, the crucial thing was that the standards were set at a very high level when the DFIs and the MDBs were in. And therefore that sets in place future transactions to take place. The high watermark, the standards that we want to see in place have already been set. So I think this is one strategy. I know Anuj said it's been done before, but I think there is some merit to continue to do some of these transactions repeatedly where MDBs can provide that catalytic finance, and then after that maybe look at winding back or stepping away, and then the private sector playing a larger role. So that's something that I would like to see a little bit more.
Excellent. Tofika?
I think sustainability is often linked to, well, I think most of us here are working in the infrastructure space. It's a patient business. So hopefully COVID-19, we're seeing the turn of it, and understandably putting ourselves in the shoes of government in the past 2 years, responding to how to procure vaccines and what measures on healthcare. I mean, those were burning issues. From our side, from the GIF side, we actually had a very, very busy year in the past 2 years of helping. I think we added another 50 projects in our portfolio of transactions that we are working on, just because there were additional needs. And we are making it a requirement of looking at, defining what is building back better. It's not just a nice catchword. What are the requirements coming from the MDB world? Of course, sustainability has always been part of our DNA. And we have faced lots of criticism, right? Be it the World Bank or ADB or others, that MDBs take for a long time. Our requirements are difficult. The good thing, because I think we have to be positive, is that there was a question in the Q&A of why the private sector should be bothered. Actually, the private sector is quite bothered. Maybe they have their shareholders or their constituents asking for the financing, supporting of projects that are financeable. We're seeing large number of funds and developers getting away from coal and other type of investments because it's no longer acceptable. So I think having a combination of all parties, the government, DFIs, NDBs, private sector, all coming in together and pushing for this. I think the headlines seem dire, but it is dire. It's no longer do we do this? It's we have to.
Yeah, absolutely, Tofika. We really have to do this. Darwin, from your perspective and from the Indonesian context.
Yeah, as a part of our support to the government for the recovery, we channel financing to national recovery program to many sub-national governments to support improving their economic growth, which were affected by this COVID-19 through multitude activities. Some of these activities, such as hospital and civil development, for example, may have a role in addressing some climate and biodiversity challenges. For this kind of financing, our safeguard teams conducted assessment of exclusion list, review, and assessment on information provided on the screening review matrix provided by each sub-national government. This assessment aims to determine the activity's readiness for financing or whether further environmental and social assessment needs to be carried out. This policy, probably what we see is to we see that this should be enhanced. That we need to see this integration, our policy with the assessment on the climate safe alignment with Paris Agreement and impact on SDG. We also envision that our ESG framework should be still developed by establishing a relevant committee in which all issues with regard to ESG can be planned, discussed, and evaluated. That's from me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Darwin. And Catherine, I know ADB has been particularly active in this area. What are your reflections on this? You're on
Apologies. I think the opportunity that the COVID crisis has brought is looking at risk differently, and I think that's the opportunity that we have, and then hopefully using. I mean, I think people have been quite stretched with dealing with that crisis, so therefore it's building on what we know has perhaps worked before bringing in too many new elements as we go forward.
Thank you, Catherine. And Anuj, you get the last word.
Right, thanks, Anders. Yeah, I mean, my last word would be, maybe 2 or 3 things. Firstly would be deepen the finance mechanisms, the green finance mechanisms. I completely agree with what Pa Darwin was saying, which is, try and focus on subnationals, because a lot of project pipelines are after all created there. So deepen the finance mechanisms explicitly to try and target subnationals. Create very strong eligibility criteria for choosing projects which get financed by these to cover the targets that we want for nature-based solutions or green, depending on which framework you want to use. And third, basically inculcate this whole concept of 6 or 7x, which is $1 of public sector money, leverage or catalyze $6-7 from the private sector. And if you can do that, then you get all your blended things, etc. happening. That's what I would suggest.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So with that, I see that we're drifted over time here. So I'd like to thank my esteemed panel for all of their input. I'm sure we could have gone on for a while longer, but maybe we can save the rest of the discussion for another time. I'd especially like to thank Enrique and ADFIAP for all of their support, for really enabling this collaboration and this report. And I'd like to thank our audience, of course, for attending and following all of this. We have some links on the thank you page here where you can find out more information. If you have specific questions about the report, please reach out to Sergio. His email is there, and he is an expert on all things sustainable infrastructure. So he'll be happy to field any questions. And with that, thank you very much. And I wish you all a very good evening or good afternoon, wherever you might be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.